and welcome to the NewsX Sunday Guardian Roundtable. This week we are going to be focusing on the narrative of nationalism that seems to be taking the center stage in our political conversation today. What defines nationalism? Is Hindutva another label for nationalism? And more importantly, who gets to decide what is national, what is anti-national, what is seditious, what is patriotic? Joining me on the roundtable for this is Pawan Verma, he is a leader from the JDU, Manish Tiwari, national spokesperson for the Congress Party, Dr. Subramanian Swamy, BJP leader and Rajya Sabha member, and Dr. Sanjaya Baru, he is an author, political commentator and also a former editor. Dr. Swamy, since the BJP seems to have taken upon itself to be the custodian of nationalism, so can you define to us how do you understand by that word?
Well, first of all, we do make a distinction between patriotism and nationalism.
Okay.
Patriotism means you love this country and you defend it. But nationalism we regard is a much more narrower concept, but also a more complex concept, where you accept the identity of an Indian as someone who's a Hindu or someone whose ancestors are Hindus. And we also expect that a nationalist will propagate the correct history of India, and not the ones written by the British and followed up by the Congress. Will, if not learn Sanskrit himself, at least propagate that it should be learned. The economic philosophy would be one which would harmonize material progress with spiritual values. And finally, governance will be based on decentralization and Swadeshi. These 5 things constitute, in our opinion, nationalism. So that's the distinction you make. So I can say somebody is a patriot but not a nationalist. For example, I have held Owaisi as a patriot because he does stand up for the country, especially when he's abroad. And but I don't consider him a nationalist because he doesn't accept that his DNA is the same as mine.
Now that's a very fair definition. Would you agree with Dr. Swamy? And also, aren't the lines getting blurred? He's made a good distinction, but you know, especially on the social media, especially in the political conversation.
No, I think, Priya, you've raised a very fundamental issue. You see, in order to arrive at what nationalism means, you have to first define as to how do you really delineate a nation. And in my conception, or in our conception, a nation is that when you're together, you are stronger. Number 2, India as a place has enough space for all its people, irrespective of their caste, color, creed, religion, region, their station in life. So the Indian story is big enough to accommodate everybody. And number 3, India's innate strength comes from recognizing and respecting the dignity of each individual. And number 4, anything which is based upon negativism, a negative definition of nationalism, and which preaches or promotes fear and hatred, that needs to be rejected and that needs to be combated. That's that's our definition of nationalism. And so therefore, or that's how we conceive the idea of India, from where springs the definition of nationalism.
Pawan, your opening comments, and do you see this idea being stifled in today's politics?
No, I am hearing for the first time that in a nation the noble spirit of nationalism is linked to religion, especially in nations which have been for millennia a place for many religions to belong and feel that they are part of the same country. And in fact, to say that only a Hindu can be nationalist is to devalue Hinduism. The Hinduism I know, and I have written several books on it, has a profound saying by our sages which says, Ekam Satya Vipraha Bahuda Vedanti. There is one truth, wise people call it by different names. My Hinduism says, Udara Charitanam Vasudev Kutumbakam. In other words, that for the broad-minded, the entire world is your family, and I have seen India interpreting nationalism in the context of a collective solidarity rather than an exclusion on the basis of your personal beliefs in religion. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, I have seen in recent times nationalism or ultra-nationalism being used as a shield to cover up the failings of the government. If you have not delivered, then whip up a sentiment of nationalism in order to overarch it. I have also seen nationalism, to be honest, being used to stifle any form of dissent from what is considered to be God-ordained dominant opinion. If you have the temerity to question, to ask, to interrogate, in a dialogic civilization which is Hinduism, to ask and question and interrogate or have a different point of view, you are dubbed as Deshdrohi or anti-national. In other words, nationalism has become an instrument to stifle the vibrancy of a democracy. I think the time has come to call it a spade is a spade. We don't need certificates of either patriotism or nationalism from self-anointed theologians in this sphere. We are proud to be Indians and we think we are national.
Okay, I know you want to come in, but Dr. Varu first, your opening comments on what everybody said so far.
You see, first of all, I mean, in a sense, drawing from all what has been said, the unique thing about India, in many ways unique, is that it is an ancient civilization and a young nation. I have felt over the years, and I have written about this, that the idea of nationalism as we have been taught in our textbooks is derived from the European experience of the nation state. It's derived from the Westphalian concept of a nation. It is not applicable to India because India is a civilizational entity, right? And when we say it's a civilizational entity, we say, when you say I'm an Indian, my language is different from yours, what I eat is different from yours, my religion may be different from yours, the way I live is different from yours, and yet we are Indian, and that is what defines this nation, right? And the struggle of the last 70 years, maybe a little more than 70, has been to define the concept of nationhood within this civilizational context. And I think we have heard two very different views. One identifies this idea of a nation with the dominant religion, and the other identifies the nation with the history of its evolution. And I would go with that because, forget about Muslims, because I think in a sense for the BJP, the dominant issue is about the loyalty of Muslims, which is an issue in almost all multi-religious societies because of the concept of ummah. Where is your loyalty first? To the religion or to the nation? So this comes up again and again, not just in India, it comes up in many countries. But we have Buddhism. Buddhism came up in opposition to Hinduism. It is a religion that Hinduism later came to accept. Buddha became one more, in a sense, a Hindu god. We have Jainism. We have Sikhism. So we have so many religions which are not Hindu, and which you can say, as Dr. Swami just said, that they all accept that their ancestors may have been Hindu. Not necessarily, because in a sense this is a confluence of so many races and ethnic communities across a vast geographical space. And India historically has been a crossroads of Asia. We forget that. We think we are a boxed-in society, but we actually have been a crossroads of Asia. You have Mongoloids from northeast, to Dravidians in the south, and to the what are called Aryans or whatever they may call it in the northwest. It's a complex mixture of so many ethnic entities. So I think, coming to your question, I would say that we need to have a much broader definition of nationalism that does not in any way make any religion feel insecure.
That seems to come,
well, first of all,
the crux of it.
No, first of all, you see, most of it is platitudes I've heard. I never said a word about religion. When I spoke about the identity, I did not say religion. When I spoke about the need to know the correct history of India, I did not speak about religion.
But that is the subtext of all the nationalist.
No, that's a different matter. You asked me.
You said Hinduism, or you recognize the ancestors.
Yeah,
that's the point you made.
That is
I think
point.
Sanskrit, I agree with you.
The DNA shows that Muslims, there's research published not only in India but in foreign journals like the Journal of Genetics of Cambridge University, which show that the DNA of the Indians is the same. And for them to think that they are Arabic or Turkish or Mongols or whatever, that is where the problem arises. So I have never said a word about religion. I only said either you are Hindu or your ancestors were Hindus. And the reason I say your ancestors are Hindus is because the fact of the matter is that the science says so. They're the same people. If there is we don't accept caste as birth-based. That is Varna, because the British use of the word caste is wrong. We have Jati and Varna. Jati has got limited applications, mostly in marriages. But the Varna is a decentralization of power, and it's got nothing to do with birth. And so, where is this religion that has been put in here? Because this has become a propaganda, a fashionable propaganda, that, you know, I don't believe in religious thing. We are not for Nazi concept of nationalism.
Priya, may I, Dr. Swami actually raises a very interesting point with regard to DNA. You know, the fact remains that if you go by the DNA markers, then every Indian can trace his ancestry back to a common African mother. So therefore then we are not really either Hindu or anything else, but was possibly all originate from a common African mother. And there is empirical DNA evidence for that. And number two, number two, you see, there are multiple identities in India which actually exist together. For example, I have a subnationalistic identity. I'm a Punjabi, yet I'm an Indian. I'm an Indian, yet I'm a Punjabi. So therefore, these are complementary terms, you know, which are interchangeable. So therefore, to define nationalism in a very monoistic or a very narrow manner does not do justice to the civilizational genius of this country.
You know, I really feel that in a sense, by having an exceptionally rigid, inflexible or doctrinaire view of what constitutes nationalism in terms of your perception of DNA, weakens nationalism. And I believe it does so because for countries like ours, which, as Sanjaya rightly pointed out, have travelled a 5,000-year journey in one civilizational crucible, and have therefore created, apart from the recent notion of nationhood under a constitution, have had the legacy of a civilizational backdrop. In that country, to keep on chiseling the definition of who is a nationalist and paring it down actually weakens the strong and vibrant fiber of nationalism itself. And I believe that is dangerous. I believe that those who are doing so may be well-intentioned, but somewhere they are weakening the notion of nationalism. I think this is a point that we must take into account.
And also, and a little more, you know, in the contemporary dialogue conversation today, is it becoming more and more strident today, the tone of nationalism? If you question the RBI governor, you're anti-national. If you question the army chief, you're anti-national. So there has to be, you know...
If you question Raghuram Rajan also, you're anti-national.
Well...
No, you see, first of all, I'm not surprised that there is a sense of national patriotism or nationalism in this country today, because it is sweeping the world. You look at what is happening in the West, you look at what is happening in China, you look at what is happening in large parts of the world.
And there are some differences like France.
Well, even in France, look, France, we can debate how we interpret that. But the fact
or
is...
Netherlands. Or Netherlands.
Yeah, but look,
I'm saying, but you're right.
In all these countries, there is a sense of the nation, right? And we are influenced by the global discourse. Secondly, in our own country, people forget. In the days when I went to school, you had to stand up when the national anthem was played at the end of a movie.
Yeah.
Every single movie theatre, we all stood up, and we shouted at guys who did not stand up. Nobody forced us, right? This was, I'm talking the 60s, after the war with Pakistan. That is when the singing of national anthem in cinema theatres. I grew up in an atmosphere in which we had to do that. So from time to time, that's why I said you are an ancient civilization but a young nation. And don't forget, even in a country like the United States, which is now more than 200 years old, you know, the idea of flying the flag at every home. You know, you drive across the United States, people are flying the national flag at homes. And here we had to go to court to get the right to do that. The idea of nationalism is an important idea that keeps coming up again and again. because it's a nation in the making. We are a nation in the making. At the far ends of this subcontinent, that idea is questioned every now and then. I mean, Kashmir, for example, there is a questioning of whether we are Indians or not Indians, right? So it's extremely important in India that this idea of nationalism is renewed from time to time. But I think we should renew that idea in a way everybody feels part of it rather than feeling excluded.
Yeah, the idea of renewing is dividing rather than uniting.
See, the question is, each has a definition of nationalism, but I am targeted for what they call as a narrow definition. Mine is a very broad definition, and I also say that I make a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. A man should be satisfied if he is a patriot. Second, the United States was quoted. Their foremost scholar, Samuel Huntington of Harvard, wrote a book called Who We Are, or Who Are We, all right? He says we are a white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Christian, English-speaking people. The British Prime Minister who resigned now after that Brexit business, he also defined Britain as a white Christian nation. Now both were questioned on the same lines. We have so much diversity, we got Chinese, we got Indians, we got... He said, yes, they are citizens of this country, but the formation of this country was based on this concept, and that's the identity of this country. So a distinction is made. I am not saying that this is the definition we have and this is the definition we intend to foster. Now you can't say that your definition is superior to mine. You have a different definition. I don't agree with it.
You can say it politely over here, but you say it in the social media and you see what happens to everybody. Anyway, I'm going to come. I'll take a break and come back right to you, but after a quick break. Hello and welcome to the NewsX Sunday Guardian Roundtable. Well, over here we're trying to define what exactly is nationalism and also who gets to define what is nationalism. Is it the role of the government or is it the role of the country at large?
No, Priya, three quick points. Dr. Swami talked about the definition that Samuel Huntington put forth. To some extent, President Trump adopted that definition. But then there was a huge pushback, especially on the Muslim ban, etc., whereby...
Blacks.
Not
white.
Whereby people said that, look, we are a nation of immigrants. We are a country which has been built by immigrants. So therefore, if you are going to define us in such exclusive terms, this is not what America is. And that's why you had the Muslim ban being struck down by their courts. That's number one. Number two, when you talk about nationalism in the context of Europe, you see, over the last 300 years, sovereignty, Westphalian sovereignty in Europe has been a very fluid concept. So you've had some of these poles which go back a longer time, Britain, France, etc. But many of the European nations actually emerged from the debris of the Second World War. And number three, if you are having this dumbing down discourse on nationalism in this country, this is the tyranny of 140 characters. So therefore, if you are not wanting to look beyond the multi-layered, nuanced identity called nationalism and want to dumb it down to a 140-character sentence, whereby if you don't agree with my definition of nationalism, you are anti-national, I think you are going down a very, very slippery slope.
Okay. And Pawan, recently I heard Amit Shah say it's okay if you question the Prime Minister, but you cannot question the nation. Now in this, when they are trying to entwine the Prime Minister and the nation, I think, how do you differentiate?
So I think that in a democracy, whether it's the Prime Minister or the nation, every citizen, and let me emphasize what I'm saying, regardless of his ethnicity or DNA, is entitled to ask the questions within the purview of law. By asking a question, I do not become anti-national. In fact, very often, the modern definition of nationalism is the ability to ask the right question in the interest of your nation. I also consider it, with respect to those who may differ, a form of intellectual deference to quote scholars from the US and the UK and ignore the vast civilizational ideological legacy of our own country, whereby in fact, as I had said earlier, leave alone the notion of national inclusion. There is the notion of kutumbukam, you are part of the family. That is the kind of legacy we have inherited. And Hinduism, incidentally...
I think the international scholar was in reference to all the international examples. Trump.
So I say that there are enough reasons to quote from our own legacy. In fact,
Glad about that.
and I think
Samajwadi Party is getting Indianized.
They prove definitively that the concept of belonging, which is an essential aspect of nationalism, and I believe even the distinction being drawn beyond the point between nationalism and patriotism is both artificial and motivated.
How so?
Because I may be a national technically, but because of whatever falls in my DNA, my patriotism may be questionable by those who believe that either you agree with me or you are neither a nationalist or a patriot. I think these distinctions are not
Pawan,
really
this question comes up in an interesting way, since the example of the United States was mentioned. People oppose...
No, I mentioned it because you mentioned it.
People oppose the war, right? There were citizens who said we will not join the...
Burnt American flags.
Right? Now, since you asked the question earlier, questioning the army chief anti-national or not, questioning the government going to war and not willing to fight for the country. They survived as citizens of the United States. So I think Pawan's point about, you can be questioned for your patriotism when you take positions which are nationalistic is a valid question. I mean, I can be a nationalist Indian fulfilling all the qualifications of nationalism as have been defined. Hindu, ancestors are Hindu, I'm born here, etc., etc. But I may refuse to fight in a war tomorrow because I don't want to go and get killed. Am I being patriotic or not being patriotic?
Our army anyway is voluntary, by the way.
No,
so there's no question of compulsion here.
I'll give you the last word since you've been...
I'll say, see, the issue is that the idea behind nationalism is to create a unified society. And the points that I mentioned are those which unite the country. Now, you can go on finding that you can't say who are you to stop me from saying this or that. The Indian Constitution itself provides for reasonable restrictions, including that you cannot advocate disintegration of the country, which is a part of the reasonable restriction. You cannot have a triple talaq because that's also part of the reasonable restrictions. So, to say that I have absolute right to say what I want, sorry, that's not in the Constitution.
On a lighter note, Dr. Swamy actually went to court against those reasonable restrictions. One of them being that defamation should be decriminalized.
Yes.
So therefore, some of those some of those reasonable restrictions in Article 19.2 really need to be revisited.
I didn't go against reasonable restrictions. I went against the definition. I said criminal defamation is not part of the reasonable restriction.
He's trying to find a reasonable voice in you, Dr.
One thing we have not
Swamy.
talked about, which as an economist, and I'm sure Dr. Swamy would agree with me, I regard as very important, is economic nationalism. That is something which we have not talked about.
And that's a whole new debate. I'll call you all back. But, but right now, that's it. That's all we have time for. Swadeshi, yes, let's not forget that word. So we're going to discuss Swadeshi perhaps at a later time, but for now, that's it from us. Thank you for watching this show. We'll see you again same time next week.